Hi, welcome to The Real News. I'm Charles Lenchner. Today we're looking at the runoff election in Chicago for mayor to be decided at the polls tomorrow. Lori Lightfoot and Toni Preckwinkle, both African-American women, both with historic runs, consider themselves to be progressive. And they both have a lot of connections to politics done the Chicago way, meaning part of the Democratic Party's machine. We're talking today with Camille Erickson, a graduate student at Northwestern University and the author of a comprehensive article about the race for In These Times. Welcome, Camille.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being on. Camille, were you born and raised in Chicago?
I was born in Chicago, yes.
What kind of background do you bring to this article, which is really in depth?
Well, I, have grown up very involved in local politics. I will say, while I was born in Chicago, I did go to high school in Oak Park River Forest, which is a first-ring suburb of the city, and I think that's important to note. And I spent some time in Minneapolis as well, but have made my way back to Chicago to report on the city where I'm from.
Excellent.
And yes.
One of the biggest set of issues in Chicago, and these of course are very linked, the murder rate, gun violence, the police killing of Laquan McDonald, which was captured on video, and we're gonna see a clip about this in just a second. But we're thinking about how these candidates relate to this set of issues. Let's see that clip.
People say you've given the cops a break. In June 2000, 17-year-old Robert Washington was shot and killed by a Chicago police officer during an attempted carjacking. The Office of Professional Standards ruled the shooting unjustified, but you overturned the ruling. You said there was nothing you could do because the police superintendent rejected the finding. Would you advocate for harsher punishments for police officers, and what specifically would that look like?
By the time this case got back to me, the command channel review, that means supervisors of the officer, were recommending that no punishment be done. So by the time it got to me, there was a 30-day recommendation on the table, and I upheld that recommendation to fight to make sure that there was some discipline against the officer.
Ms. Preckwinkle, 30 seconds.
Sure. Many of our officers are good and decent people who struggle every day to do a very difficult job well, and we need to acknowledge that. Look, it's important to understand that Lori Lightfoot, at the same time that she received appointments from Rahm Emanuel to various police accountability positions, was also defending police for misconduct and being paid by the city to do so.
So how are Chicagoans responding to this story? What kind of conversation is happening about Preckwinkle and Lightfoot?
Well, I think it's important to start with the video that we just saw, which is the murder of a 17-year-old black teenager, Laquan McDonald, at the hands of a white police officer, Jason Van Dyke. And it's a really traumatic video that has been circulated and flooded the media for years. And I think Chicagoans are still not numb to it, or they shouldn't be. And I think it really attests to how this one event and how the really systematic brutality that the Chicago Police Department has had toward disproportionately black and brown residents within Chicago is something that is the backdrop to this mayoral election. And I think that there is still a big wound when it comes to not just this murder, but even also the killing of Rekia Boyd, a 22-year-old young woman who was shot by an off-duty police detective, Dante Servin. And I still think that the activists that I've been speaking with and the community organizers I've been speaking with on the ground, this has not left their memory, and I think has really shaped the mayoral election significantly. And I can tell you a few reasons why. The first is that Lori Lightfoot is, she is a former prosecutor, and she also served, as a chief administrator appointed by Mayor Richard Daley. So I think a lot of times this this election has been seen as change versus experience, and change being Lori Lightfoot coming in and disrupting the Democratic machine, as many call it, within Chicago, and Toni Preckwinkle representing experience, since she's served, you know, as an alderman for 19 years and is now Cook County Board President. But I think really both of them have their hands within an institution and within a machine that has not been serving a lot of very marginalized residents within the city of Chicago.
We're talking about two leading candidates, both African-American, in a city that's recovering from these killings that you described. But if memory serves, and your article mentions this, they were not prominent voices in demanding accountability from Rahm Emanuel or the Chicago Police Department when these issues were up for contestation. How do residents explain that absence?
I think it's very much on the forefront of their minds, because as we have two progressive candidates that have come up, which to a political outsider, I would say they sound very similar at the many debates and forums that we've heard in the last few weeks. So people are looking to their track records. And when they see that there hasn't been, as you mentioned, a really declarative stance when it comes in reaction, when it comes to police accountability in the past, I think there's skepticism from residents of whether or not change is really going to happen within Chicago, and they're really going to be working within the interests of residents or continuing to protect the Chicago Police Department.
Well, this thread of a city administration, a Democratic Party machine that works hand in glove. Police is the most significant expenditure of the city. There's a financial crisis looming with pensions of city workers. It feels as though the system has come out with two challengers to each other who are very similar in a sense, depriving residents of the ability to vote for someone who's going to be different. Why was this the outcome, given that there was such a large field of candidates going into it?
Yeah, we had a field of 14 candidates going into the February 26th election, and we're down to 2 now in the runoff for April 2nd. And I think people certainly want change. We've had, I think it's important to note that we've had Mayor Rahm Emanuel for 2 terms. And he has really pumped quite a bit of money into the downtown and already invested neighborhoods at the expense of the South and West Side, which is home to the majority of residents of color within Chicago. And I think it's also worth saying that the Black population has declined by 25% within the last 2 censuses since 2000. And I think many residents, especially Black residents, just haven't seen a future for themselves from folks that I've spoken with in Chicago. And I think that also we have, you know, within the last 12 years, the complaints and misconduct cases brought against the Chicago Police Department have cost the city $600 million in settlements. And I think that also Rahm Emanuel has shuttered 50 schools in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods and shut down half of the mental health facilities. And so I think the city is in crisis, and the city has been in crisis for some time, and folks have been speaking out against it. But I think that this particular election is really, and the fact that we have Toni Preckwinkle and Lori Lightfoot as the 2 remaining candidates in what will be, you know, a tight race, although polls are saying that Lori Lightfoot will be coming ahead, I think is a testament to this history of Chicago and residents having enough.
Well, one thing I read was that because the Radical Teachers Union, led by Jesse Sharkey, which supported Chuy Garcia last time around, because they're in the tank for Preckwinkle, that somehow reflects the fact that she would be a more progressive mayor if she was elected versus Lori Lightfoot, who I'm told is receiving a lot more donations from corporate sources. How can we interpret that from a distance?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to look into the endorsements as well as where the campaign money is coming from. And the Chicago Teachers Union, CTU, is a very powerful force within the city of Chicago, has backed Toni Preckwinkle. And I think, though, that it's important to say that both candidates have received corporate, donations. But overwhelmingly, Lori Lightfoot's background has come under most scrutiny. And I think having, she has funds in a 501c4 for Change Chicago, which a WBEZ report called, dark money. And she's also receiving support from people like John Canning, who is a private equity investor, and other folks who have supported the privatization of education. And so I think that that it's really important to look at where the money is coming from and to see who whoever becomes mayor, who they're going to have loyalty to, who are they going to have, some remaining debt to. And I think that also it's important to note that Toni Preckwinkle, was a part of the city council, which the city chairman, Edward Burke, who is the longest serving chairman, he has been charged with alleged extortion or attempted extortion with owners of a Burger King, and, had organized a fundraiser for Toni Preckwinkle, and while she returned that campaign money, I think both of them have come under a lot of criticism from where they're getting their funding and money, and it's important to follow that trail. But in terms of the CTU backing, as you mentioned, Toni Preckwinkle, she spent 10 years as a teacher, although she also supported charter schools within her ward. And so both of them are very complicated candidates, and I think something that I heard from organizers again and again is that both of the candidates are flawed. Both of the candidates are not perfect. And when it comes to progressive politics, the very core of progressive politics is holding politicians accountable. Whoever gets into City Hall, whoever gets to oversee City Council is going to have to answer to activists on the ground. Whether it's Lori Lightfoot or whether it's Toni Preckwinkle, both of them are going to be having protesters at their doors.
One of the organizations that gained more prominence before, during, and after the rise of the Black Lives Movement and the release of the Laquan McDonald video is Black Youth Project 100, which, as you know, is a national organization at this point. But the kinds of activists that they represent, having gone through a journey of focusing on protests and organizing and then having some electoral interventions, what kind of power do they think they're going to wield once the election's over and the voter is no longer having a say for another 4 years?
I think that they have incredible power in the city, and I think that both candidates have really actually started to respond to them. And I think both of them are, I think both of them have really felt the need to be cognizant of the demands that they're making, which, to be honest, is really the abolishment of prisons and police. And I think that they see Lori Lightfoot as someone who often, when questions are posed to her, her solutions are, we should invest more into the police. We should invest more into training. We should convert the 38 closed schools into police academies, although she walked back to her statement saying that if that were to happen, that she would want pretty intense community input. But I think it's something to be said that BYP 100 is pointing out that a third of the city budget is spent on a police department that has really a track record of abusing Black residents. And I think that it should, there's a $95 million police academy that's set to be built in the west, in the west side of Chicago in Garfield Park, and activists, a part of No Cop Academy and BYP 100, have really come out against that, saying that $95 million should be invested in mental health clinics. It should be invested in grocery stores. It should be invested in education. And I think when looking at the two candidates, Toni Preckwinkle has really been one to suggest a little bit more of those holistic approaches to responding to public safety issues. So looking at what are the root and more systemic reasons why violence is plaguing our city.
Well, given all the need for drastic change that exists in Chicago, do you think the outcome of this election is going to be a real change for Chicago, or is it going to be mostly more of the same?
I do think that it's going to be a change for Chicago. I think even just this past debate and campaigns that we have seen have really allowed us to uncover what does it mean when we say progressive politics, because even that word should be scrutinized. And I think it really means, serving all residents in the city of Chicago, especially those who have been neglected and overlooked for so many decades. And I think that both candidates are one, and they're going to have to, they're going to have to listen to activists on the ground. They're going to have to listen to BYP 100 and No Cop Academy. I think that it is significant. Yes, we're going to have a Black woman be mayor of Chicago. It's long overdue. We need that representation, and representation matters. And I think that it's a election that we can really look towards when we're trying to move forward and make a more equitable city that, and where justice is going to be served for residents of Chicago.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Camille Erickson, author of the In These Times article about the Chicago mayoral election, which is this Tuesday. Thank you for watching the Real News Network. If you enjoyed this segment, please do subscribe so you'll see our other broadcasts. Thank you.